Hi, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for that. Thank you for the three introductions. It's great to be here today. Thanks to Lane Simon and Eric Schneider and Mark Stern and Urban Studies for inviting me out. Thank you to all of you for coming out today. How many of you are coming from the protests that were at 4 o'clock? Anybody? So I want to first say thank you to the sociology department at Penn and to Urban Studies for creating a space for undergraduate research that I got to thrive in. And for all of you who are writing about issues of pressing moral urgency as undergraduates through this program and through social sciences at Penn, it was great to meet some of you today, and it's really exciting to see what you're working on, and I urge you to continue this work after you graduate, to continue to write and research and find out about the issues that matter to you and bring public attention to them. When I was an undergrad here, I got to take Michael Katz's class in urban history pro seminar, and he let me in as an undergraduate, even though it was a graduate class, because that's the kind of person he was, and that class changed my whole life. He taught Jane Jacobs and Du Bois and Loïc Vacon and Tom Segru, and it was through that class that I think I learned what it was to be an engaged scholar from Michael. And the last time I was here, and maybe the last time lots of you were here, were for his memorial. So I just want to say thank you to Michael and that you were missed. So what I want to present today is an account of mass imprisonment. It's an account of mass imprisonment and its more hidden systems of policing and surveillance. And it draws on 6 years of fieldwork that I conducted with young men and women living in a mixed-income African-American neighborhood in Philadelphia that in the book is called 6th Street. I'm going to talk today just about one family, the Taylor family. And through this story of this family, I'm hoping to kind of make the argument of the book in a different way than I made it in the book, to show you the buildup of US policing and imprisonment, to show you the way that the criminal justice system is currently operating in poor communities of color across the nation, but in particular in Philadelphia, to show you some of the different experiences and orientations that residents of poorer neighborhoods have to a criminal justice system that has come to deeply penetrate and organize everyday life. How are people coping with this? How are people resisting this? A system that views black young men as the enemy to be rounded up. And I'm going to tell you about the book, and then I'm going to close with a few words about the broader reform movement and the broader reform moment that we're in, and a bit about what it's been like to be on the road talking about criminal justice reform, the pressing need for reform for the past 8 or so months since I published this book. And then I want to end with a few words about Ferguson and about what kind of change can become possible when people come together to protest grave injustice. So the story from the book that I want to tell today, it doesn't begin in the tough on crime turn that the country took in the 1960s and 70s that launched what would become the largest prison system in world history. It begins in the sharecropping South. How are you all doing? Okay. So George Taylor came up from Georgia to Philadelphia when he was 5. His father and mother worked the cotton fields south of Atlanta, and like many sharecroppers, they often came up short at the yearly settle. The money that, since the cost of the basic necessities that they purchased from the plantation store was more than what they had made in the fields, at least according to the owner of the plantation who controlled the books. Mr. George remembers his father cursing the owner of this plantation for manipulating the numbers, which his father could not read, and then he remembers his family leaving late at night for the next farm, his mother hopeful that this one would be better. The Second World War brings opportunity up north, so with hundreds of thousands of fellow field hands and indebted farmers, Mr. George's father boards a train to Philadelphia. He sends for his wife and children later that year once he finds work. This is 1943. For most of George's childhood, The family lives in a 2-room flat in South Philadelphia. How many of you are from Philadelphia? They live in a 2-room flat in South Philadelphia. George's father works as a stevedore down at the docks. And like many stevedores, he doesn't know when he shows up for work if he's going to get any work that day. And if he does, he faces long and back-breaking hours. Mr. George's mother cooks and cleans house for 2 white families in Center City, the neighborhood that I was raised in downtown Philadelphia. Neither job pays as much as they'd been promised when they made the move from the South up to the North during the war. To his father's shame, it's really his mother's income, more steady income, that supports the family. Mr. George's parents fought a lot in the 2-bedroom flat, in the 2-room flat, this cramped apartment, but the couple stayed together and had 2 more children. Mr. George graduated from high school with excellent grades and entered the US Army in 1959. Anything to get out of the house, he said. Mr. George did well in the newly integrated unit he had been placed in and left the military with a bad knee and an honorable discharge before the Vietnam War broke out. It was a piece of luck that he never forgot. He applied for a job at the US Postal Service, and he worked as a clerk at a branch in Southwest Philadelphia from 21 until he retired at 65. A few years after taking this job, in his early 20s, Mr. George buys a 3-bedroom row home on a quiet tree-lined block in the neighborhood that in the book is called 6th Street, which is a pseudonym, right at the edge of the city limits. At the time, he's raising his young daughter, Linda, his wife having taken off with another man. Mr. George and his daughter were among the first Black families to move to this neighborhood of 6th Street, and after them came physicians and bank tellers and government workers and shop owners, small business owners. Like Mr. George, these middle-class families were hoping to escape the crowded and run-down ghetto by moving just past its outer edges. The move to 6th Street represents years of effort for Mr. George and his family, but in many ways, his military career, his job at the post office, and now this spacious house in a good neighborhood exemplify the triumphs of the civil rights movement. Gone are the days of separate drinking fountains, perpetual debt, police harassment. In one generation, the Taylors have moved from second-class tenant farmers in the Jim Crow South to white-collar respectability in the North. Not that their new neighbors exactly welcome them with open arms. One of the families that moved in shortly after Mr. George and his daughter Linda got a brick in their living room window, and Linda refused to sleep in her own bedroom after that. Mr. George hoped that his daughter would grow up in an integrated community, which was the community he moved into, but by the 1980s, every white family in the neighborhood had packed up and moved. Legal segregation had ended, but not a single white student attended his daughter's school. Even so, 6th Street remains a middle-class area, less violent than other neighborhoods nearby, cleaner sidewalks, bigger houses, better-kept lawns. In the mid-1980s, this too begins to change. Developers start placing low-income housing in the area, initiatives that older residents attempted to fight politically and lost that battle. It was this second wave of less refined residents, Mr. George felt, that really set his daughter in the wrong crowd and down the wrong path. By her own account, Miss Linda's father spoiled her as a child, especially after her mother left. She came of age at the height of the crack boom and dropped out of high school during her junior year. The men she dated worked at the bottom of the crack business too, some of them, which at the time is offering decent wages and even the promise of wealth to unemployed young men in the neighborhood around 6th Street who are attempting to find legal work in the legal economy and being turned away again and again and again. During a decade of hard living, Miss Linda gives birth to 3 sons, Chuck in 1984, Reggie in 1987, and Tim in 1991. By this time, the ghetto that Mr. George had worked so hard to escape seems to have grown up around him. Alongside the problems of drugs and violence and unemployment, the problems attendant with poverty, 6th Street begins to face another problem by the late 1980s, an expanding police presence. Beginning in the mid-1970s, the US federal and state governments enact a series of laws that increase the penalties for buying, selling, and possessing drugs. We instituted steeper sentences for violent crime, ramped up the number of police on the streets and the number of arrests these officers made. Street crime has risen in urban areas in the 60s and 70s, and politicians on both sides of the aisle see a heavy crackdown on drugs and violence as both the political and practical solution. There could have been many solutions at that point. For example, policies that enabled African American young people to get work, to get legal work. Policies that addressed poverty, schooling. But tough on crime policies were the policies that we chose. By the 1980s, crime is rising again, and crack cocaine becomes a national moral panic, further fueling the punitive policies that had begun years earlier. As Miss Linda's sons, Chuck, Reggie, and Tim, come of age in the 1990s, what's happening to crime in the 1990s? Plummets, yeah, just drops. Down, 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 down. So crime is in this major, major decline that we're still in today. But tough crime policies continue in this era. In 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act pours billions of federal dollars into urban police departments across the country, creates 50 new federal offenses. Under the second Bush administration, the near unanimous endorsement of tough on crime policies by police, civic leaders, politicians, accompanies the mushrooming of state and federal agencies, special units, bureaus. So like these crime shows that you watch, like CSI and NC, something, that's this money. These policies are increasing the sentences for violent offenses, but they also increase the sentences for prostitution, vagrancy, gambling, drug possession. With stronger drug laws, steeper sentencing guidelines, and a lot more federal dollars pumping into urban police departments, neighborhood officers patrolling on foot and charged with keeping the peace and mediating disputes get replaced by specialized units in cars equipped with this impressive new technology who are organized not to keep the peace or mediate disputes, but to make arrests. A statistical program called CompStat gets implemented, first in New York and then in lots of places around the country, including Philadelphia. The way this plays out in Philadelphia, the number of arrests an officer or unit makes becomes indication of performance. So those officers that arrest or cite more people get promoted, and those officers who don't are encouraged to catch up. So this shift from a laissez-faire law enforcement regime, kind of keeping the peace style, mediating disputes, foot police officers, into a tough on crime, arrest-based, quota approach. It's not leveled at the entire population. It's not, for example, directed at the undergraduates at this institution or at any other elite university who are, in fact, using a lot of drugs and getting into fights and driving drunk and lots of rape on college campuses, as we hear more and more about. Lots of possible felonies here, but the police are not directed to these young people. This tough on crime approach, it's directed at black neighborhoods, and it's directed at poor black neighborhoods and at Latino neighborhoods to a lesser degree. At first, Mr. George and his neighbors view all of this expanded policing as a welcome sign of change. The neighborhood has been neglected by law enforcement for far too long. But as more and more young men began disappearing to jails and prisons, Mr. George and his neighbors start to question the motivation behind this ramping up of policing. Some suspect that under the cloak of this tough on crime rhetoric and the war on drugs is in fact white discomfort about black civic and economic incorporation. To put it more bluntly, they figured that white people were not going to accept black people as full citizens without a fight. As black Americans like Mr. George achieve the full rights of citizenship that have eluded them for centuries, as they successfully defend the right to vote, the right to move freely, to attend college, to practice their chosen profession, the United States simultaneously begins building up a penal system with no historic precedent or international comparison. Right at the sunset of civil rights, we do this. So up until the 70s, the US has this really stable imprisonment rate, flat, flat, flat. Then in the 1970s, it starts climbing up, until leveling off in the 1990s at an extraordinary rate. We now imprison 5 times more people per capita than we did 40 years ago. Another way to put that is that between 1970 and 2005, the US imprisonment rate went up by 700%. These numbers, they are staggering and they are historically new. But when you look at certain segments of the population, they look even stronger. So black people make up 13% of the US population, but account for 37% of the prison population. And these racial differences are reinforced by class differences. So it's really poor African Americans and poor African American young men who are the targets of these policies. 60% of those who do not finish high school will go to prison by their mid-30s. This is because certain segments of African American young men are committing more crime than everybody else. That's totally a logical explanation. That's a legit question. It turns out it's not true. It turns out that we have these racial disparities because black communities are policed, arrested, and imprisoned under quite a different system than the one that the rest of the country is living under. So today I want to try to show you a bit of what that looks like. Okay, how are you doing? Okay. Mr. George's grandson, Chuck, is the eldest of 3 brothers. He shares a small second-floor room with Tim, 7 years his junior, and Reggie, born right between them. Reggie leaves for juvenile detention centers by the time he turns 11, so Tim, the youngest brother, doesn't get to know his middle brother very much. He looks up to Chuck, his oldest brother, almost like a father. When Tim was a baby, his dad had moved down to South Carolina and married a woman there. He did not keep in touch. Chuck's father came around a lot in the early years and became a father to all 3 boys in a way. The boy's mother, Miss Linda, remember Miss Linda, Mr. George's daughter? She's 5 years into a battle with crack cocaine when she becomes pregnant with Chuck. And she continues this struggle as the boys grow up. With welfare cuts, the family has very little government assistance, and Miss Linda is not able to hold down a job for more than a few months at a time. They are poor. Her father's post office pension pays the household bills. It pays rent and electricity and heat, but it doesn't pay for food or school supplies or clothes for the 3 boys. Mr. George says it's beyond what he can do and not his responsibility anyway. At 13, Chuck begins working for the local dealer, which means that he can now buy food for himself and for Tim, rather than asking his mother for money that she does not have. Tim told me a couple weeks ago that when his brother started working for this dealer, that was the first time that he was getting like 3 square meals. And he remembers this as this boost of nutrition into his life and stability. It also stabilizes his mother too a bit, because now she's coming to Chuck to get drugs instead of dealing with other guys in the neighborhood who are sometimes coming into the house and acting violently. So in high school, Chuck is supporting the family by working for the local dealer, selling crack hand to hand. And in high school, he gets arrested a number of times, but the cases don't stick, and he continues working for this dealer. By his sophomore year, his feet are sticking out past the edge of his bunk bed that he shares with Tim. He clears out the unfinished basement of their house and moves his mattress and all of his stuff down there. The basement floods and it smells like mildew, and sometimes the rats bite him, but at least he has his own space now, which he's thrilled about. Tim is 8 when Chuck moves down to the basement, and he tries to put a brave face on it. When he can't sleep, he pads down to the basement and crawls into bed with his brother. In his senior year, when we met, Chuck stood 6 feet tall and had a build shaped by basketball and boxing, his 2 favorite sports. That winter, he got into a fight with a kid in the schoolyard who called his mom a crack whore. He pushed the kid's face into the snow, says the school cops report. Didn't hurt the kid much. The next day, he was fine, but the school cop charged Chuck with aggravated assault. So Chuck is now 18 in his sophomore year of high school, and it doesn't matter as he's trying to fight this charge from the school cop that he's on the basketball team and he's making C's and B's. The school cop does not care. So the case lands him at age 18 in the Curran-Frumhold Correctional Facility, which is CFCF, this large pink and gray county jail on State Road. How many of you have been to CFCF? Locally known as simply the F. About a month after Chuck went to jail, Tim stopped speaking. He would nod his head yes or no, but he didn't say any words. When Chuck would call home from jail, he would ask his mother to put Tim on the phone, and she would put Tim on the phone, and then he would try to talk to his brother about what he imagined was happening in his life or what was happening in the neighborhood, and try to get him to respond, get him to laugh. Tim never laughed, but sometimes he smiled. And Chuck would keep talking until his minutes ran out. In his letters and phone calls home, Chuck tried to persuade his mother to take his little brother to jail to visit him. He just needs to see me, Chuck said, like he doesn't have anybody out there. Miss Linda didn't have the state ID required to visit people in county jail, only a social security card and an old voter registration card, which would not work as IDs to get into the jail. And anyway, she hated seeing her sons locked up. Chuck's friends, Mike and Alex, and me too, tried to take Tim along with us when we would go to visit Chuck, but since Tim was a minor, a parent or guardian had to come too. So they're separated for 8 months. After 8 months, the judge throws out most of these aggravated assault charges, and Chuck comes home with only a few $100s of court fees hanging over his head. As Chuck is walking up the alleyway that's shared with these row homes that they live in, Tim sees his brother, and he runs to him and cries and clings to his leg. And he stays awake for the whole evening. We had this little party outside the house. He stays awake the whole evening, finally falling asleep very, very early in the morning with his head in Chuck's lap. Over the next few months, Chuck makes it his mission to get his brother to start speaking again, to patiently coax him to use words. He stays in most nights and plays video games with Tim on the old TV in the living room. He even moves back up to Tim's room for a while, so Tim isn't alone at night. He'll get it back, Chuck said. He just needs some quality time with me. Tim nods hopefully. The following fall, Chuck tries to re-enroll again as a senior in high school, but the school does not admit him. The secretary says he's now 19 and he can't qualify. So then he's a high school dropout. Then the judge on his old assault case issues him a bench warrant for failure to pay the $225 in court fees that had come due after the case ended. He can't afford the $225, so then he has a bench warrant out for his arrest. Then he's on the run, which is the title of the book. He spends a few months on the run like this before he and I go down to the Warrant and Surrender Unit in the Criminal Justice Center downtown. How many of you have been to the Warrant and Surrender Unit? It's in the basement, yeah. To see if he can get some kind of work out a deal with the judge. This is a big risk. When you go into this room, you see people coming in, trying to get their warrants dealt with, and you don't know when you come in with a warrant whether they're gonna seize you and you're not gonna make it home that night, or for months, or for years, or who knows how long, or if you're gonna be able to make some deal. And you can see men in front of you in line being walked away in handcuffs. So that doesn't happen that day. It was a great day. The court clerk works out a monthly payment plan, and Chuck comes home jubilant that afternoon. That fall, Tim starts speaking again. He remains very quiet, though, preferring to communicate with a small smile or a shake of his head. Now he texts. He texts all the time. Still doesn't speak very much. So home now from jail, and with his younger brother speaking, and with these court fees, he's dealing with them, he starts looking for work, really looking for work in earnest, every day, pounding the pavement. Along with his friend Mike, he goes around applying for jobs all over the city, Walmart, Kmart, PetSmart, Wendy's. He uses my cell phone number as a contact because his cell phone was getting cut off too much to be a reliable conduit for job leads. And every day he asks me if they have called, and every day I have to say that they have not. Month after month, applying for the lowest wage part-time jobs that we have. No callbacks. And at the time I haven't read Diva Pager yet. I don't know that African American men with felony convictions have to apply something like 75 times before they get one call back, that white men with a felony conviction have an easier time getting a low-level part-time job than a black man without a felony conviction. I don't know any of this yet, but I'm going through this process of looking for work with Chuck. And I can tell you that of all the things that happened in the neighborhood in the time I was there, this was the most crushing, the futility of looking for work for Chuck. It broke my belief that American society is a place of opportunity, a place where anybody who works hard can make it. After a number of months, Chuck gets too desperate and too hungry, and he gets some crack to sell on credit from a local dealer. And he's sitting in my kitchen, cutting the crack and putting it into little baggies, and he says, "I fucking hate this shit. Fucking hate this shit." Tim's first arrest, back to Tim. Tim's first arrest comes later that year, after he turned 11. Chuck was driving Tim to school in his girlfriend's car, and a cop pulled them over and ran the tags and ran their names, and the car came up as stolen in California. Neither of them have ever been outside of the tri-state. They weren't sure. Chuck wasn't sure. It was his girlfriend's car that he was borrowing. He wasn't sure at what point in the buying of this car of his girlfriend's relative, like at this auction in Northeast, was the car stolen. But anyway, he gets charged with receiving stolen property, and Tim, age 11, gets charged with accessory to receiving stolen property. And later, a judge in the juvenile courts places Tim on 3 years of probation. Okay, with this probation sentence hanging over his head, any encounter with the police could mean a violation and a trip to juvenile detention. So Chuck begins teaching his younger brother, Tim, how to run for the police in earnest, how to spot undercover cars, how and where to hide, how to negotiate a police stop so he doesn't put himself or those around him at greater risk. He's just determined to keep him out of juvenile detention. So on quiet afternoons, Chuck would pass the time by teaching Tim, now age 12, how to run from the police. They'd sit side by side on the iron back porch steps of their 2-story home, looking out onto this shared alleyway, and talk about how to go about this. "What are you going to do when you hear the sirens?" Chuck asks. "I'm out," his little brother replies. "But where are you running to?" "Here," like their house. "You can't run here. They know you live here," Chuck says. "I'm going to hide in the back room in the basement," Tim says. "You think they're not tearing down that door?" Tim shrugs. He says, "You know Miss Toya?" "Yeah," Tim says. "You can go over there." "But I don't even know her like that," Tim says. "Exactly," Chuck says. "Why can't I go to Uncle Gene's?" Tim says. "Because they know that's your uncle. You can't go to anybody who's connected to you." Tim nods his head, seeming happy to get his brother's attention no matter what he's saying. By the time I got to 6th Street in 2002, a few years before this, police curfews were established for those under age 18, which meant that anybody under 30 could be stopped and searched. Then with stop and frisk, this becomes even more legitimated. In the first year and a half that I spent in the neighborhood, I was taking notes every day and writing down what the police were doing and lots of other things too. So in the first 18 months that I was there, in this 4-block radius, I watched the police stop people in cars, search them, run their names to see if any warrants came up, ask them to come in for questioning, make an arrest at least once a day with 5 exceptions. I watched the police break down doors, chase people through houses, question, arrest people in houses, interrogate them 52 times in the first 18 months. 9 times helicopters circled overhead. 14 times I watched the police punch, choke, kick, stomp on, beat, or strangle young men with nightsticks after they had caught them. This is the first year and a half that I'm there. In 2007, Chuck and I go door to door and conduct a household survey of the 6th Street neighborhood. On that day, a little more than half of young men between 18 and 30 report that they're presently entangled in the criminal justice system in one way or another. And reading the reports coming out of Ferguson, the number of warrants that people have, low-level warrants, the number of court cases and court fees that they have, boy, that was sounding familiar. I don't know how many of you go around every day wondering when the police will take you, thinking that any moment you see them, they'll probably arrest you. I think for some of you in the audience, this is part of your life, and for some of you, This is unimaginable. For Chuck and Mike and their friends, this is an unavoidable fact of everyday life, that any encounter with the police could mean that they are seized. So today, across the country, 5 million people are under probation or parole supervision. 2.5 million people are in prison. Another couple million are arrested every year. We don't know how many people have warrants because we don't yet collect national data on warrants. Philly has a large number of warrants. The numbers I have been quoted from police vary. New Jersey is more interested in publishing those figures. So in New Jersey, there's 1.6 million open warrants in New Jersey right now, almost entirely for small things, for citations, court fees, technical violations of probation or parole, failure to appear for a court date. In Philadelphia, there are a number of police divisions specifically searching for people with these kinds of warrants. From interviews with police, I learned that each detective division has a special warrant unit. Then the US Marshals, the sheriffs, the DEA, the FBI, the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms run their own warrant units out of the Philadelphia force. Then there's a separate warrant unit of the 1st Judicial District, which is another like 60 guys going out every day looking to round up people with warrants. And these special units, how do they do their job? They access all kinds of data, Social Security records, court records, hospital admission records, electric and gas bills, employment records. They visit people's, quote, usual haunts at the times they're likely to be there, and then they threaten friends and family with arrest if they don't provide information about how to get them. At the time I was writing, a police officer, a local FBI guy, had developed this very sophisticated computer mapping program that plotted people in the neighborhood with legal entanglements, so probation, parole, house arrest, pending court cases, and then he could see those people and then go to those people and threaten them with jail time unless they gave up the person who they were looking for that day. He did a great interview with a Philadelphia paper and I think the the Philadelphia Daily News. And he said he developed the program while watching a documentary on the Stasi, the East German secret police, one afternoon. What does this mean to grow up in a neighborhood with this kind of policing regime? Well, children in the neighborhood learn at a very early age to watch out for the police and to prepare to run. The first week I spent on 6th Street, I saw a child of 5 and a child of 7 play a game of chase in which one played the role of the cop who would run after the other. When the play cop caught up to the other child, he pushed him down, cuffed him with imaginary handcuffs. Then he took a quarter out of the child's pockets and laughed and yelled, "I'm seizing that." Asked the child if he was carrying a gun or any drugs. In the following months, I saw children play this game many times. Sometimes they would just give up running and put their bodies flat on the ground or up against a car or up against a wall. Children yelled, "I'm going to lock you up, I'm going to lock you up, and you're never coming home." Once I saw a 6-year-old child pull another child's pants down and try to do a cavity search. Here's Chuck's counsel to his 12-year-old brother, Tim, who's now on this 3-year probation sentence. He says, "You hear the law coming, you run away from them. You don't have time to think, okay, well, what do they want from me? No, you hear them coming, that's it, you're gone, period. Because even if they're not looking for you, 9 times out of 10, they'll probably book you." As I began to write about how young men were navigating this level of policing and arrests and probation and court days and jail, I started also to try to pay attention to what this all meant for the women in their lives, girlfriends, moms, sisters, neighbors, who were also facing their own problems with the police, but in a different way. In particular, women were in this situation of being put under pressure by police to provide information about the men that they love. So by the time a man has been arrested a number of times, at least in this city, the police have considerable information about where his girlfriend works, where his mom lives, where his child goes to school. And they have this information because every time you get arrested, you're asked to provide, and charged, you're asked to provide this information. And then the more of it you provide, the lower your bail will be. So once you've been arrested a number of times, the police have a huge amount of this information. And then they also have these databases that they can go through, whether they have any personal information about you or not. So with this information, armed with this information, police visit a man's family members, partner, and work on getting them to talk. This is a lot of what police work is today. It's about getting family members to provide information. So as one former warrant officer told me in an interview, he said, "We might be able to track everybody with their cell phones or see every guy with a warrant in the neighborhood up on the computer screen. But when it comes down to it, you always go through the girlfriend, the grandmother, because she knows where he is and she knows what he's done." So in our household survey that Chuck and I conducted in the summertime in 2007, we interviewed 146 women. 139 of them reported that they had a partner, neighbor, or close male relative who was either wanted by the police, on probation or parole, living on house arrest, or in a halfway house. 67% of the women that we interviewed said that they had been pressured by law enforcement to provide information about the men in their lives within the past 3 years. So if you think about this kind of pressure, it's not really something that's happening to like the families of like the 10 most wanted people in the country. It's happening routinely so that the police can round up enough people to make their stats. Miss Linda, back to Miss Linda. How are you all doing? Her ability to resist this kind of pressure was widely recognized in the 6th Street community. In fact, she was famous for it. Mike, Chuck's close friend, once proclaimed to a group gathered around her steps after a police raid, her house might be dirty, but Miss Linda's not talking. She doesn't care if you bang if they bang her door in. She doesn't give a fuck. Miss Linda would often say that she protected her sons so strongly from the police because she had more heart than other women. She also had more practice because she had 3 sons instead of 1. Chuck, Reggie, Tim, and their friends hung out in her house a lot, and in the 6 years that I knew this family, the police came 23 times. When her middle son, Reggie, was 17 and home for a bit from juvenile detention, the police stopped him for loitering on the corner, and he allowed the police to search him. An officer discovered 3 small bags of crack in the lining of his jeans, which I believe now in California, through Proposition 47, are not even a felony anymore. It's a misdemeanor. You're not going to prison for this, but not here, not yet, not now. So Reggie starts running. The cop loses him in the chase, and then an arrest warrant is issued for possession of drugs with intent to distribute, as well as for fleeing the police. So that evening, Miss Linda prepares her house for the raid she feels sure is coming. The raid for these 3 small bags of crack in the lining of her 17-year-old son's jeans. She takes her marijuana and hides it at her boyfriend's house. Then she, after a lot of effort, she secures accommodations for Chuck's close friend Anthony, who had been sleeping in her basement and who had a bench warrant out for failure to appear in court, and who the police would seize if he was there when they raided the house. So Anthony goes. She lets her neighbors know that the police might be coming so that their sons and cousins and brothers can leave in case the police search multiple houses or they get the wrong house, which sometimes happens. She digs out the $60 that Reggie has hidden in the wall because the police typically take whatever cash they find. Then she persuades her father, Mr. George, to sleep at his girlfriend's place that night in case she says the law gives him a coronary. So Miss Linda instructs her son Reggie, her middle son, to leave before the raid, to leave before midnight, but he falls asleep, and he's still there when this 3-man SWAT team busts the door in at 4 in the morning. The door is still broken and unlocked to this day. Miss Linda has slept on the couch in preparation for this raid, and she's not sure if Reggie's in the house or not when they come through the door. So she launches into this heated argument with the police officers, trying to forestall them from going upstairs so that Reggie can get away in case he's still in the house, which he did. He got away through the window before they came up there. So success. People talk about resistance. It's like, this is what resistance looks like. Keeping the police in conversation after they've raided your house at 4 in the morning so that your son can leave through the window. The next night, 3 officers return and order Reggie's younger brother Tim and Mr. George, who are now in the house, to lie face down and put their in handcuffs while they search the house. And by search, I mean tear apart. According to Tim, an officer promises Miss Linda that if she gives Reggie up, they will not tell him that she's the one who betrayed him. She says she can't count on that, though. If she doesn't give Reggie up, they say that she will call Child Protective Services and have them take Tim away because the house is unfit to live in. On this night, she again refuses to tell them where to find her son. Shaken but triumphant, she comes out early the next morning to tell her friends and neighbors the story. We sit on her iron back porch steps that look out onto this alleyway, and she says, "I do my dirt, I'm the first to admit it. Some people say I'm a bad mother. You can say all you want about me, but everybody knows that I protect my sons. They can come back every night." When her cousin comes to sit with us, Miss Linda repeats the story, adding that she has deliberately worn her sexiest lingerie for the raid and has proudly stuck her chest out when the officers were handcuffing her against the wall. She acted this out for us to shrieks of laughter. She said that she told a particularly good-looking officer, "Honey, you're so fine, you can search me anytime." Later in the day, more police officers come to search the house, and while they're pulling it apart, once again, Reggie phones to see if they're there and if she's okay, and she plays off this call as if it's her mother asking about Pampers for her granddaughters. When the police leave, Miss Linda tells me, "Mr. George is going to tell me to clean this shit up," meaning the chaos of the raid, "as soon as he comes in, but I'm not cleaning until next week. They're going to keep coming, and I'm not putting this house back together every fucking morning." I was there 2 nights later when the police raided the house for the 3rd time. On this night, 3 officers put us in plastic handcuffs, lied us face down on the floor while they searched the house. Despite her previous proclamations that she could handle this and she had told the police off, Miss Linda cried and screamed when they threw her on the floor. An officer mentioned that the family was lucky that Mr. George, the grandfather, owned the house because if it was a Section 8 house, public housing, they could be immediately evicted for harboring a fugitive or interfering with an arrest, as we had seen happen to 2 other families recently. Upstairs, the police, I'll skip that because I'm running out of time. Okay, all right, so 3rd raid, okay. I'll tell that part. Okay, so they find a gun upstairs, which Miss Linda could not produce a permit for, so they arrest her on this gun charge and take her in. It turns out you can have a gun in Philadelphia without a permit if it's in your house. That's your legal right, but we didn't know that, they didn't tell us that. So they keep her there for many hours, and then Tim and I go to pick her up the next afternoon. She gets into the car and says that they have not given her any food and that they have promised her anonymity if she gives up her son, and that she again refused to do so. So this 3rd raid and the lengthy interrogation, it weakens her resolve. When Reggie comes around later that evening for the spaghetti that she has prepared for him, she begs him to turn himself in. He refuses again. A week later, Miss Linda's coming home from her boyfriend's house, and she finds her TV and clothing dumped in the alleyway. Mr. George, her father, tells her that he can no longer allow her to live there with Tim if she's going to continue to hide her son from the police. He just can't take it anymore. He says, "This ain't no damn carnival. I don't care who he is. I'm not letting anybody run through this house with the cops chasing him, breaking shit, spilling shit, waking me up out of my sleep." Mr. George begins calling the police whenever he sees Reggie in the house. He just wants it over with at this point. And Miss Linda tells Reggie that he can no longer live there. Reggie, for 2 months, lives in an abandoned Buick LeSabre parked in a nearby alleyway. So here, under extreme duress, Miss Linda nonetheless refuses to tell the police where to find Reggie, raid after raid after raid. She ultimately begs him to turn himself in, and then she evicts him from the house when her father threatens to evict her, but she never gives him up to the police. So while Reggie is sleeping in the Buick, she keeps in close touch with him, supplying him with food almost every evening. Her neighbors, her family, Reggie himself seem to believe that she's done the best she could, at least better than anyone else could have done. That evening, the evening that the cops find Reggie hiding in a shed, I ask Miss Linda, I sit with Miss Linda and some of her neighbors, and she pours wine into little plastic cups for us. And she says, "Well, at least he doesn't have to look over his shoulder anymore, always worried that the law was going to come to the house. He was getting real sick of sleeping in the car. It was getting cold outside, and plus Reggie's a big boy and his neck was all cramped up. And then he used to come to the back like, "Mom, make me a plate." And then he'd come back in 20 minutes and I'd pass him the food from out the window. After these raids, Chuck and Reggie are sitting in county jail and state prison, respectively. A month later, their younger brother, Tim, gets booked outside of the Chinese store for resisting arrest and possession of marijuana. In the absence of his 3 grandsons, the house becomes strangely quiet, and Mr. George begins sitting outside on the second-floor porch. One evening the following fall, I had just been to visit Chuck in county jail, and we sat down, Mr. George and I, and had a beer and a cigarette. Mr. George says, "I'll tell you, I feel sorry for the man with sons. What's the use of raising a boy today? You feed him and clothe him and teach him how to ride a bike, and you check his tests, and then at 15, they're shipping him off to juvie. You don't know when you're going to see him again. Maybe he makes it to 18 before they take him away. And once they grab him, that's it. Your son's locked in a cage, just sitting. They say it's changed now with Obama, it's a new era, but can't nobody protect our sons, even the president? I'm telling you, if I was 30 years younger, I'd be praying for girls." What I've sketched here today is a system of governance. It's a system of governance that is now operating in poorer African-American neighborhoods in the United States that is separate and distinct from that under which the entire rest of the population lives. At the level of lived experience, it involves the denial of basic rights to many residents, that is, the right to move freely, the right to sleep in a bed of one's choosing, the right to associate freely with other people, and it involves the risk of extreme sanction, that is, prison, a reality facing a great many residents. We see the emergence of an underground market to provide for people living with diminished legal rights, like people selling clean urine, fake documents. We see the uselessness of the authorities for protection or mediation, despite their omnipresence. We see frequent and public acts of state violence in the streets, that is, young men being beaten, chased, strangled, or even killed. We see the pitting of close friends and family members against each other, that is, the authorities routinely asking people to choose between their own freedom and the freedom and security of those they hold dear. We see this pernicious issue of informants, both through the police's efforts to cultivate them, but also through people turning each other in when their backs are up against the wall. And we feel this at the level of the community social fabric, in the games children play, in what an older brother teaches a younger brother. At the same time, people are resisting the police. Young men are refusing to turn themselves in. Mothers are refusing to cave under police pressure and turn in their sons. In some ways, the technologies, the policing approaches, the levels of imprisonment currently at work in segregated Black neighborhoods in US cities, this is a dramatic shift from anything we've ever seen. But the case can also be made that the core features of the system are not new, at least in their essence, and they don't even require the kinds of advanced technologies deployed here. So Loic Vacon and very persuasively Michelle Alexander have argued that current levels of targeted imprisonment mirror earlier systems of racial oppression, such as slavery and Jim Crow, both of which granted Black people a secondary class citizenship, denying basic rights like voting, running for office, free movement. We can see in this system of surveillance and warrants and court cases and probation that I've just described here, we can think of it as a continuation of the fugitive slave laws that haunted African Americans in the South and the North until the Civil War. We can also see in the current system, for the historians in the room, a continuation of the vagrancy statutes that took over from the fugitive slave laws that followed African Americans through the Northern migration. From this history, we can conclude that many Black people in the United States have been assigned not only a diminished form of citizenship, but a fugitive status, a fugitive life, through slavery, sharecropping, the Northern migration, and now through the war on crime. At the same time, I think what I've sketched today, it may remind some of you of other systems that have been called totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. This account makes more sense when you start to read about people living under dictatorships of various sorts. during wartime, living in occupied territories. So residents of East Germany before the fall, they described quite similar experiences to young men on 6th Street, like the government's turning family members, friends, and colleagues into informants on a massive scale, people being seized in the streets, acts of state violence that are in public view, pervasive fear of the authorities. What's interesting and distinct here and important is that this intensive policing and imprisonment regime is operating within our liberal democracy and unbeknownst to many people living only a few blocks away. So in a nation that has officially rid itself of a racial caste system, that elected and re-elected a black president, we're simultaneously deploying a large number of criminal justice personnel at great taxpayer cost to visit a fairly repressive policing regime on poor black men and women living in segregated neighborhoods in US cities. So in these neighborhoods, the institutions that are charged with providing safety and justice are instead sources of fear and instability. Do I have like 2 more minutes? 2 more minutes? How are you all doing? So for the past 8 months, I've been going around the country talking about, telling this story and talking about the 2 US justice systems, the one for whites and the one for African Americans, in particular the one operating for poor African Americans, and trying to get people to accept that the criminal justice system is acting as an occupying force, as Mike's mother calls it, in poor communities of color, rather than a source of public safety, an institution accountable to citizens, the way any public institution should be, schools, hospitals. I've been trying to get people to see the grave injustice in a police force that is at heart operating on the front lines to maintain a racial caste system in this country through violence, through arrests, through searches and raids and imprisonment, through the denial of rights and privileges. So I've been talking about the massive harm that the criminal justice system has been doing at colleges and at libraries and in bookstores and at Harvard and at 2-year community colleges and in the Rust Belt and on the coasts and at law schools and criminal justice schools and at libertarian think tanks and with heads of foundations and people who are formerly incarcerated. And through all of this, I have to say, what I've mostly learned is hope. I've gotten to know a lot of people who are working towards reform across the country, and people on both sides of the aisle, people who have been in prison, people who are in the Department of Justice, people who are prosecutors, even some police officers, people doing grassroots organizing, people who are heads of foundations. We're in this moment where we've never been in a moment for the past 40 years where more change is possible or more change is happening around these issues than we are right now. Real change is afoot, and the question is, can we be part of it? Can we move it forward? Can we make it as big a change as possible? So I'm much more optimistic about reform than when I started writing this book. This was before Michelle Alexander. This was before the president was coming out on racial disparities, before federal sentencing reform, before propositions and sentencing reform across the country. The killing of an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, by Darren Wilson, a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and the decision by a grand jury not to indict this police officer, and the protests following both of these events, the almost entirely peaceful protests around the country that are even still going on. I think this calls a huge number of Americans to the reality of a US justice system that treats African Americans, and particularly African American young men, as people without rights, unworthy of dignity, as the enemy, and that African Americans are sick of it and have been sick of it for a long time. The message is, you are not safe. We are not here to protect you. In fact, you are the target. The protests, I think, are a vivid reminder to white Americans that of the pent-up frustrations of African Americans with a criminal justice system that is plainly illegitimate and unaccountable. And the very high level of warrants for people in Ferguson, the huge number of families strapped with court fees, the number of people behind bars, the police violence that goes on with impunity, This all could be Philadelphia, it could be San Diego, it could be Boston, it could be Oakland. Despite these facts and despite the palpable exasperation of African American communities across the country and lots of other people too, policymakers are showing very little moral urgency. They're showing little moral urgency to address a second-class citizenship status for African Americans under the criminal justice system that is a human rights scandal of historic proportions. Can a problem this large be solved? How to solve it? Again, I want to say that this is the moment. We're in this little moment where criminal justice reform is happening after 40 years of tough on crime. For the past couple of years, we've seen these modest decreases in incarceration rates, mostly coming out of New York and California. We went back up a little bit this year. More jurisdictions are under federal civil rights violations or are under consent decree than ever have been before. There's reform happening. There's really positive reform happening across the country around policing, around sentencing. And as Bruce Western says, what we're not seeing yet is a coordinated effort, a comprehensive set of reforms, police, courts, prisons, sentencing, prosecutors, probation and parole, all these pieces and players of the criminal justice system need to change what they're doing, need to acknowledge the massive harm that they've been inflicting on poor communities of color. We need to commit as a nation to ending this project of mass incarceration, and this requires leadership at the highest levels, and it also requires, I think, all of us speaking out, marching in the streets. This is the challenge now. Thanks.